I'm Joeita, and this is The Pulse. All parents worry about their child's future, but if a child has a disability, it's normal for parents to have additional concerns. Parents worry about things like what kind of life would my child like to live and where? And if my child can't work, how can I make sure expenses like rent and transportation are covered? How do I set aside money for my child's future without impacting government benefits? Questions like these can keep parents up at night. It can be perplexing to wade through legal jargon. Writing a will, finding a trustee, or even having a conversation with family members can seem daunting. Today, we discuss financial planning for a child with a disability. It's time to put your finger on the pulse. Hello and welcome to The Pulse on AMI Audio. I'm Joeita. In today's episode, we talk about some of the complex questions that arise when you are the parent of a child with a disability and you want to do the right thing and ensure your child has a good quality of life without impacting government programs and benefits. It's a pretty thorny area, and I will readily admit that there's not a lot that I know about it, and what little I tried to read up in preparation for this interview made my head spin. So I'm really delighted that I can be joined today by a fantastic resource within the disability community and someone you may have been familiar with already. Ron Malice is the founder of Reegan Financials. He's a financial advisor who specializes in working with people with disabilities. And he's joined us today to talk about the estate planning process for the parent of a child with a disability. Hello, Ron, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Without seeming nosy, can I ask how you got into doing this work in the first place? Because you're probably one of the very few people with this expertise in dealing with families with disabilities.
I actually got into it. I used to do something quite different over a decade ago, and I just decided to get licensed to learn and maybe fiddle around, but found out that I enjoyed this kind of work. I'm talking about selling, managing investments and insurance. And then I landed on the RDST, Registered Disability Savings Plan, and found that really interesting. And as I started to dig, I realized that the people that are eligible for the RDSP and their family members have to navigate a very complex terrain that goes well beyond the factors presented by the RDSP. And I just saw that as a really compelling area of work that I just kept on digging and realized that there was a serious need for expertise in this area that the financial sector wasn't really effectively addressing. And I enjoyed the work, so yeah, that's how it all started over 10 years.
Well, you know what they say, if you love what you do, you don't do a day's work. So I'm glad to hear that you enjoy it. When we think about parents of children with disabilities and they have conversations with you about estate planning and putting money aside for their child's future, out of curiosity, at what stage in their life are these parents coming to you? Is it when their children are very young, or is it when their children are a bit older? Have you noticed any sort of a pattern here?
Sure. So first of all, I'll tell you that 70% of my clients are parents with children with disabilities, and the age of the children in my practice range from under 5 years of age to over 50. And then that's the children. But what I found over several years was that parents were showing up at my door for the first time when their child with a disability was in their mid-20s and the parents were in their mid to late 50s. So
why do you suppose that is?
Well, first of all, the most predominant disability that you'd find in my practice is developmental disabilities, and so first of all, somebody can your child can stay in high school until the age of 21. At that point, you age out. And by that point, we're also on likely on ODSP, the Ontario Disability Support Program. And so when your child who, let's say, is on the autism spectrum is 8 years old, you don't know what he or she's going to be like when they're an adult. You don't know what their needs are. You don't know how independent or dependent they're going to be. So I find that parents are reluctant to engage in the financial planning and also, long term, because it's very abstract. And so when they hit 25, around that age, couple of things. First of all, let's say their son Charlie's not in high school anymore, and it's they were hoping that Charlie would be able to work, and maybe he's done a bit of work here and there, but hasn't been able to sustain employment, or it's a very part-time job, or it's intermittent, or maybe no work at all. And parents are in their mid-50s and more actively thinking about their own retirement, and also thinking about their own mortality, thus estate planning, and everything becomes felt more sort of visceral, tactile level, and they take action.
So, Ron, when you're thinking about this whole process of estate planning, there is so much that one has to think about as a parent, and that's without factoring in a child with a disability. But if your child does have a disability, what are some of the specific considerations that a parent has to contend with that the parent of a child without a disability probably doesn't even need to think about?
So the first one I'd say is capacity issues. Disabilities come in all shapes and forms and affect people in different ways. And some disabilities affect a person's capacity to, for example, manage their own personal affairs, including their own financial affairs. So if they lack capacity in some way and to some degree, then that becomes an issue or concern to address and consider as you go through the planning process. The other major component that comes up is dealing with a program like the Ontario Disability Support Program, which in Ontario is social assistance for adults with disabilities. And there are other commensurate programs in the other provinces, and they're all different, but my expertise is with ODSP. And the challenge there is how do you structure your estate knowing that your child is on ODSP, and if you don't structure that estate properly, you could jeopardize your son or daughter's eligibility for ODSP and potentially make them uneligible, potentially even on a permanent basis, because you don't do the right estate planning.
One of the things that I've heard about, and remember, I'm not the financial advisor here, but one of the ways I've heard about is you set up some kind of a trust to try and get around this issue of not cutting somebody off from provincial social assistance programs. And, it's not just the ODSP or some kind of a support program that can help with daily living expenses. It could be things like programs that assist with home renovations or buying assistive technology. And, so there's a lot of things that come into play here. Can you talk about in what way a trust might be helpful in this situation? What are the common types of trusts, and when is it useful to have one?
Yeah, so there are many different types of trusts. But the type of trust that is primarily used in this circumstance is what's called the Henson Trust, which is actually, in legal jargon, what's called an absolute discretionary trust. And so instead of leaving assets directly in your child's name, which would threaten their eligibility for programs like ODSP, you leave the assets in a Henson Trust where your child's the beneficiary of that trust. And essentially, the absolute discretionary component means that the trustee or trustees have absolute discretion over the management disbursement of those assets in that trust or the beneficiary, meaning that, number one, if you're the parents, you cannot stipulate in your will certain parameters that the trustee must follow in terms of how to manage and disperse those assets. Nor can the beneficiary make any demand that would be legally binding when the trust is in force. So as a result, those assets are there for that child's, that quite likely an adult child's benefit, but those assets do not belong to them, at least from the perspective of qualifying for programs like ODSP.
Right. And so there wouldn't be any questions about, exempt amounts and eligibility because it, in a manner of speaking, doesn't belong to you at all. Now, if you're a parent and you're thinking, okay, well, this Henson trust might be a good way to go about securing my child's future, making sure they have some income from the trust, but not jeopardizing their provincial social assistance. What's my next step? Do I just write it into my will that I want a Henson trust? And is that done and over with, or is there a bit more to it?
No, I think there's a lot more. So there's, well, first of all, one thing is to really understand what is allowed and isn't allowed, or what are the implications, because what it sometimes takes some people at least some time to get their head around the concept, the difference between assets and income with respect to ODSP rules. So the amount of assets in a Henson trust, regardless of how much is in there, is treated as an exempt asset. But there are also rules around income. And income is not simply employment income. Income, think of it as just the act of that beneficiary or the ODSP recipient receiving money from different sources, including money from a Henson trust. And when money is dispersed from a Henson trust, there are stipulations and rules and restrictions and limits depending on various factors. And so I think too many people go into this, including trustees that are named trustee but don't understand what the landscape that they're facing. They just have this belief that the assets in the trust are exempt and that's it. And so there's nothing that can happen. And it's just not that simple. So there are a few things that I think you need to consider above and beyond just including a Henson trust in your will. Certainly picking appropriate trustees. And that isn't just based on whether you trust this person or persons, in my view at least. Well, do they have the ability? Have they ever managed large sums of money before? Do they have any understanding of investments? Do they are they responsible in tracking, in recording transactions and reporting and those kinds of things? So it's not just about whether you think they're a nice person. It's also about what they're able to do, and will they be able to manage the trust effectively.
Can you tell us a little bit more then about the responsibilities of a trustee, other than what all is it that a trustee needs to be able to do?
Well, the first thing is they need to be able to set up appropriate accounts under the terms of the trust. And, on the face of it, it sounds like, well, what would be so hard about that? But it's not as simple as you might think. All too many times I've spoken with people who have gone to, say, their bank branch and set up, supposedly thought they set up an appropriate trust account, but they set it up, banks ended up recommending they set up an informal trust account rather than a formal trust account, which that's not appropriate. And then what kind of accounts do you need? Because a Henson trust, if you include it in your will, well, all it says is Henson. Well, it doesn't even say the words Henson trust in there. It says absolute discretion, things like that. doesn't mean it magically appears. And you can have all kinds of assets in there. So you can have property in there. And so, but usually it's money, and well, are you going to invest it? So that's a different type of formal trust account, an investment trust account. Are you get and do you need a bank account a checking account set up under those kinds of things, very practical things? And what is your responsibility as a trustee to effectively manage those investments? And so where do you go for help, and how do you know you're at the right place?
And one of the things that a lot of people might do, and I can completely understand the logic with doing this, is they may want to set up a Henson trust and have as a trustee the sibling of a child with a disability. And there's a lot of really good arguments in favor of that. But are there any downsides as well, other than what you've suggested, which is, the person who is responsible for managing the trust may have an intimate understanding of the person with the disability, that, their sibling, but may not understand all the paperwork involved and may not be able to manage all the reporting requirements. But do you think there might be any other considerations when we're actually thinking about who the trustee is?
Yeah. So one thing is, when you include a Henson trust in your estate planning, you name your child with a disability the beneficiary, but you also need to name residual beneficiaries, because what happens to the asset after the primary beneficiary passes away? Well, those remaining assets go to the residual beneficiaries. So oftentimes, if you have multiple children and you name the other children or child as the trustee, there's a good chance that you're also naming them as a residual beneficiary. And so that sets up an inherent conflict of interest. Now, that doesn't mean that something inevitably will, and if something nefarious will necessarily happen, and that they'll act in bad faith, but it is a motive. It is an incentive, and there have been issues with that. So I think that parents, I really suggest that they be really honest with themselves when they consider naming their other child or other children as trustees, where because not all, I've seen it where some parents have named their other children trustees, co-trustees, and some of those children really are just wholly inappropriate for that role. But the parents, like, I don't want to see my child as anything but lovable and trustworthy.
And it could be nothing else except, the child has never had to look after the sibling with a disability before. They've never been the primary caregiver, and they just don't have the expertise to manage what can be a very complicated situation. So a little bit of soul searching on the part of the parent would probably go a long way. The other question I had, Ron, is, a lot of people over their lifetimes will accumulate money in RSPs or RIFs when you become older, and you have TFSAs. If you just name, if your child is, or payouts from an insurance company, people take out life insurance policies and you get a giant payout. If a child inherits a lump sum money through any of those means, doesn't that also put their social assistance payments at risk? So how do you handle that situation?
So you are able to name a beneficiary on certain types of accounts, like an RRSP or a TFSA. You can directly on the account, you can name your spouse, your child, your friend, whoever. And the problem is that you go and write your will and you kind of forget about the fact that you even named somebody on those accounts. And that's something to double check, because if you do that, the result might be, though, the assets in those accounts or in that life insurance policy may very well end up going to that child, and instead of the estate, and thus then the Henson trust. and you cannot then after that fact go, oh well, Dad really meant to put it into the Henson Trust, so we're just going to do that. No, that is not allowed. You're not allowed to do that. And so so you have to double check. So if life insurance is often a worthy consideration for estate planning, you have to make sure that the beneficiary designations are articulated appropriately.
The other question that I have is, not every disability gets a disability tax credit or is eligible for an RDSP. So when you're going to set up this Henson Trust, is there some sort of a threshold you need to meet, or can anyone with a disability have a Henson Trust, or is there some kind of a requirement? Like, I'm just going out on a limb here. Like, you need to have you need to qualify for the disability tax credit in order to have a
No,
Henson. Oh, you don't? Okay.
No, actually, you can. Any parent, for example, could include a Henson Trust in their will for their child, regardless of whether that child has a disability or not. That's not a requirement for the trust itself. Whether they have the disability tax credit or not does have an impact on various things, including potential taxation treatment of the trust.
Oh, you know what? You read my mind, because that's exactly what I was going to ask you about, how you do all this in a tax efficient manner, because the more you're able to, the less you have to pay in taxes, the more there is for the person with a disability. So I know that's a big topic in and of itself, but if you had to give us a couple of pointers about how to manage estate planning in a tax efficient way, what would your thoughts be?
Well, there are a few things. So one is, if they do have the disability tax credit, then what they can take advantage of is what's called the qualified disability trust election, which is testamentary trusts are taxed at the income generated by the trust on your typical testamentary trust is taxed at the highest marginal tax rate.
Hang on, let me just stop you there. What is a testamentary trust for those of us who are not?
Meaning it's ones that you included, like, for example, in your will.
In your will,
it
right.
It wouldn't be injected with assets until after you pass away.
Right, okay? Got
it. Several years ago, the government changed the tax treatment of testamentary trusts, where instead of it being taxed on a graduated basis, every single dollar of income that a testamentary trust generated would be taxed at the highest marginal tax rate, which is pretty significant tax rate. However, if the beneficiary is approved for the disability tax credit, what can be done is you can use the qualified disability trust election, which needs to be done every year, and essentially you're allowed to use that on one trust, and that trust would be taxed on a graduated tax basis.
Mm-hmm.
Saved a lot of money in tax.
Yeah, I'd say.
Yeah, the other thing is, if the parents have significant assets in RSP and RIF, there is a tax deferred rollover option where they can roll over at least a certain amount of money from their RIF or RSP after they've passed away into their child's or registered disability savings plan. That's not a no-brainer. There's some things to really consider in that regard, which is a different conversation. And the other thing is that there is what's called the Lifetime Benefits Trust that is specifically designed to for money from a RIF or an RSP or LIRA, things like that, where money can be put into that for a person with a disability, and done so on a tax-free rollover, tax-deferred rollover process. That's a much more complicated discussion.
And you would recommend that parents of a child with a disability come out and speak to a financial advisor. That goes without saying. But I was honestly surprised when you mentioned at the beginning that parents were coming to you when they themselves were in their 50s and their children with a disability were in their mid-20s. Like, I see the logic, but I wonder if you would think, in light of your experience, if there's some value in having that conversation earlier than that even. I know a lot of people in their 30s when their children are young don't want to think about estate planning. I don't blame them. But, is there some value in maybe having this conversation in your 30s or 40s rather than waiting till you're in your 50s?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a different conversation because they're living in different circumstances. When your child is 5 and they've just been diagnosed with autism, or some sort of developmental disability, particularly, that you really don't know what they're going to be like when they're an adult. You take a different approach to planning, but there are definitely something like you should still have a will. Should that will have a Henson trust in it at that point? I ask different questions to those parents, which include, do you think it's possible your child might need your financial support for the rest of their life? Rather than, does your child need, because I know that they don't know. But it's just to help them recognize that it's not an easy thing to confront, to say, yeah, it's possible Charlie might need our financial assistance for the rest of his life. And that's a scary thing to contend with and to even to think about. So, but it is good if there are things that you can start, the RDSP, if that's available for them, to start early, get your will, different strategies at that point, in my view. But I do have clients that fit that description, and I think they're going to be better off for it.
Absolutely. Ron, I think we are all better off from having talked to you. Thank you so much for talking to me about this. I have to tell you, I do feel a little less frazzled having had this conversation, so I do appreciate that you took the time.
My pleasure.
Ron Malice is the founder of Reegan Financial and a financial advisor who works with people with disabilities. I hope you'll reach out to Ron with any questions. He does specialize in the Ontario Disability Support Program. That's the provincial social assistance program in Ontario, as the name suggests. But I would encourage you, not that I like to give out advice, but I would encourage you, if you are the child of a person with a disability, if you are the parent of a child with a disability, to think about reaching out to a lawyer or a financial advisor to help you plan for your child's future. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today. Before we go, I'd just like to give out our phone number. That's 1-866-509-4545. That's 1-866-509-4545. Where you can call and leave a voicemail with feedback about the program or any questions that you might have, and do leave your permission to play the audio on the program if that's something I decide to do. You can also find us on X at AMI Audio. Use the hashtag PulseAMI. You can also find me on X at Joeita Gupta. That's JoeitaGupta, or lowercase than one word. And you can find us via email, write to feedback@ami.ca if you wanted to send us a longer message. We get some nice emails and some lovely tweets, as well as the comments on YouTube and with the podcast. It's always nice to read those. Please don't forget to subscribe and comment down below if you have any questions or feedback. I'd like to thank Ron Malice again for taking the time to speak to us today. The videographer for today's show was Jordan Steves, who is also our video editor. Mark Aflalo is the technical producer for the program. Randa Delahanty is the coordinator for AMI Audio Podcasts. Andy Frank is the manager of AMI Audio. And I've been your host, Joeita Gupta. Thanks so much for listening.